scholars. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first annual, hopefully, Title VIII Alumni Symposium. Title VIII refers to the Research and Training Act for Eastern Europe and the independent states of the former Soviet Union, which is administered by the U.S. Department of State and has funded EES, its scholars, its publications, and meetings for more than 20 years. The purpose of Title VIII is to support the field of East European studies and to foster cooperative networks between scholars, as well as between scholars and practitioners. So the symposium, as you all know, is to sort of bring people back together to reinforce the old networks and hopefully to create new ones. The theme of this inaugural alumni symposium is evaluating the effects of EU accession in Central and Eastern Europe, lessons for the Western Balkans. The countries of Central and Eastern Europe have been profoundly affected by the EU accession process. Indeed, no single state or international institution has had as great an impact on domestic change as the EU has had in post-communist Europe. 8 countries have now been members for 5 years. With the addition of Bulgaria and Romania in 2007, this means the EU is now at the current size of 27 member states. And yet further enlargement is anticipated to the Western Balkans, which is a goal that's shared by the United States and the EU. As this process continues, it is important to assess the impact EU accession has had on the country's politics, markets, societies, and international relations. A better understanding of the specific impact of accession could offer U.S. policymakers better tools with which to encourage reformers in the Western Balkans to continue their progress towards EU membership. Our first panel will focus on aspects of democracy and state building in the EU accession process. We're lucky to have with us 3 scholars who have long been associated with East European Studies program: Andrew Green, Peter Gross, and Lynn Tesser. You've probably already picked up their bios. There's a sheet with all the speakers' bios, so I won't waste time going through all of their achievements and publications. But I'll now give the floor to Andrew Green of DG Metrics and also of Georgetown University, who speak on civil society, and the title is Parsing Donor Assistance for Post-Communist Civil Society.
Well, is this mic on? All right, well, thank you, everybody. I'm one of the few who have made it over the wall into sort of the applied or policy world, and so I try to blend an academic concern for research and a policymaker's concern for practical, usable knowledge. And the research I'm going to discuss was a grant from the East European Studies program, and it examined democracy assistance in post-communist Europe, 1990 through 2004, taking a look at budget data from various donors, but especially with respect to civil society funding. The idea was to take a look at patterns and trends, but also to take a look beyond the usual bilateral or even multilateral donors, to look at private foundations and other quasi-private organizations. The context here, of course, is tremendous change in Eastern Europe during 1990 through 2004. Civil society was seen as a key actor. It drew tremendous attention from at least quite a few of the donors. Over time, though, the sort of the mix of funders and their programming approaches have changed and are changing still. The project questions were to take a look at how the mix or personality of the funding had changed over time, what other sort of funding channels we can think of besides the bilateral donors, implications for civil society's development over time and for democratic development. The methodology, I used a large number of data sources. For most of the bilateral and multilateral donors, I used the OECD's creditor reporting system, which is the main body of data for donor assistance information. I have my own data set of 50-some-odd thousand records for USAID's work going back to 1990. James Scott's database that he did for a research project on the NED that was published in Democratization, annual reports from foundations and other donors, and plus information from some of the indigenous or state sources of funding. The geographic coverage is post-communist Europe, but not Russia. And that's because it was too difficult to geographically segregate what was happening inside Russia when taking a look at programming. And just as a note, Slovenia was included as part of my sub-regional grouping of Central Europe, because of their progress towards EU accession. The OECD DAC, this is the Donor Assistance Commission, has coding rules for how you classify activity. And this is pretty problematic because every donor has their own little set of categories for how they classify activities, and then everybody makes their own decisions on how to reclassify it and fit it into OECD categories. And so you can't just take the data, you have to look at them and often recode to something that's actually more appropriate if you have better information. The time, as I said, this is 1990 through 2004. The donor coverage includes bilateral donors, multilateral donors, public foundation, or private foundations like Open Society, Mott, Ford. It includes political foundations like NED. It includes these quasi-private or public legacy foundations like the Balkan Trust for Democracy, the Trust for Civil Society in Central and Eastern Europe, and the Baltic American Partnership Fund. It does not include the Westminster Fund for Democracy because they simply refuse to provide any information. UNDP, if anybody has sources of data for UNDP, I'll pay you $1,000 right now. No one's ever taken me up on that. Open Society and Ford actually were fabulous to work with. They were really open and very helpful. All right, now to the eye-glazing charts. When you take a look at sort of the funding over time for democracy and governance programming, I broke it out by region first. And the first thing that strikes you is the gigantic bulge there for southeastern Europe. Again, this is not Slovenia. I've separated that into Central and Eastern Europe. The interesting thing about this, of course, is a lot of what's going into southeastern Europe is post-conflict funding. And then there's also EU accession funding as well. But a lot of that's post-conflict. But when you take a look at the population size, when you adjust for population size, actually everybody was right around the same little per capita range. Bilateral, multilateral foundations, everybody, of about 20 to 40 cents per head per capita, except for some of the major conflicts in the former Yugoslavs. The real sort of interesting question here for me was where this was coming from. We have this on a regional basis. Let's take a look at where it actually is coming from. Bilateral donors have, by and large, been the largest donors. And there's no real big surprise there. If you take a look at 1990, you'll see a little teeny tail there. It's part bilateral and part political foundations. And there's a little bit of private foundation in there. That's USAID, a couple of the Europeans like NORAD, and that's NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, and that's a bit of Ford money. What you see happening in the sort of early to mid-90s is a gigantic ramp-up of funding from private foundations. And that is largely OSI, but that includes Mott, for those of us who are familiar with this sort of funding, this is no surprise, and Ford. And the interesting thing is this is happening in advance of a lot of the closing of USAID and other donor offices in these countries. You see a big bump in 1998 of EU money, and then you see another bump happening around 2004. This is EU accession money. That's really what that is. And then way down at the bottom, in the bottom right corner, it's hard to see, you have these indigenous or state-based sources of funds. And these are the 1% checkoffs like in Hungary. This is the Foundation Investment Fund in the Czech Republic and some other sources like that. And it's interesting that those have popped up and they're becoming sort of useful. Okay, what was it used for? Okay, you can see down at the bottom, in that blue graph there, is civil society. And that is, by and large, the largest programming area. Another big one is that sort of purple one up towards the top, and that's government administration. That's a lot of ministry reform, privatization of state-owned enterprises, and the like. You also see a big bump in the blue by 2004 for legal and judicial reform. Again, this is EU accession money. And if you take a look there, you can sort of break it up. By 2004, and it's largely this way throughout, it's about half and half society-oriented and state-oriented. And by society-oriented, I mean human rights, elections, free flow of information, civil society. Programming intended to engage citizens directly with political processes. The other half are state-oriented, intending to change state political and social service institutions. And so this is public sector, local government, judiciaries, development organizations and the like. And it was about half and half all the way through. And so I said, well, let's take a look. Let's break it up into the two half and take a look at the top 10 donors. A couple things to point out here. First off, the United States, primarily USAID, of course, is far and away the largest donor during this time period, 90 through 2004. And it's actually fairly evenly split between society and state-oriented sort of activities. EU is in second place. And this is also largely a result of a huge influx of funds leading up to 2004. But there's a huge disparity here. It is largely state-oriented. Okay, there's no big surprise there. This is in advance of EU accession, and trying to strengthen or reform state institutions was the goal of a lot of this money, and that's fine. There's nothing good or bad to society versus state-oriented. It's just a different approach by the EU compared to the US. The number 3 slot should be surprising to people. That's open society. That's the network of open society-related institutes. And actually, if you take a look just on the society-oriented side, they're actually the second largest society-oriented funder after the US. The number 3 is Norway. That's a lot of human rights work. The other one that's interesting is to take a look at Mott down towards the bottom. A lot of work in society-oriented. Again, no big surprise if you know Mott's programming. And NED also pops in the top 10, and that's a lot of, actually on the state-oriented side, a lot of judicial and human rights work. So really, for me, the story becomes here the fairly prominent role of public foundations, and a hint that some other of these private or quasi-private actors had a much larger role than people generally recognize. So let's take a look at the private foundations here and what they did with it. The big chart at the bottom, the big blue part, is civil society, and the green is free flow of information. And if you take a look, there's a table actually in the larger paper that's available on my website, but the largest funders overall for civil society work were the US, followed by OSI, followed by Mott, then Sweden, then the EU. And for free flow of information, it's the US, followed by OSI, and then a very distant third is the Netherlands MFA, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Civil society and free flow of information is something that the private foundations really championed. And you can't understand civil society development in post-communist Europe without coming to grips with the very large role of private foundations. So let's take a look at sort of the broader fund for civil society specifically. And this is private foundations, public foundations, and other state sources. The large orange mountain you see there is Open Society Institutes. That's the big network. And the yellow is Mott, and then you see Ford sort of coming up towards the end there. And way down the bottom right, the various shades of blue are different local or state-based sources of funding, like the 1% checkoff and things like that. And so you can see the absolutely gigantic role that Open Society had played in funding for civil society. What you also see in the green up at the top is the growing role of these sort of quasi-private or legacy organizations like the Balkan Trust for Democracy, the Baltic American Partnership Fund, and things like that. It's actually too bad this research stops at 2004, because the Baltic Trust for Democracy really, or Balkan Trust for Democracy really started right around 2004, 2005, and they've really ramped up. At the same time, the Baltic American Partnership Fund has largely gone out of business. Implications for the future. All right. There are a few things here. One is, the U.S. dominance of democracy assistance is pretty clear, and particularly on the society-oriented side, you see that. Equally clear is the state-oriented approach of EU and the EU member states. If you were to go back to that table and take a look at some of the EU members and what they've done, or some of the others that didn't make the top 10, you see this gigantic skew on the state-oriented side. Again, not a huge surprise given the goal of EU accession, but there's a very real imbalance here, and that might have implications for the future. So it's understandable, and it's just different. It's neither good nor bad. What's also particularly clear is the critical role of private foundations and some of these public or legacy foundations. Open Society Institute Network in particular. Funding levels. What was interesting is that on a per capita basis, except for the huge ethnic conflict a couple of years, 99 and 2000, and leading up into Serbia into the mid 2000s. The per capita range was roughly the same, no matter what kind of source of funding it was, public foundation or private or bilateral donor. The interesting thing is, if you do a little basic statistical analysis, there's absolutely no correlation between changes in funding in any of these to any of the other. It's completely uncoordinated. And again, for those of us who are familiar and have dealt with these, that's not a huge surprise. I guess I was surprised at how clearly uncoordinated it was. I thought there might be a little bit there. But clearly there are completely different strategies and approaches at completely different times, responding to completely different stimuli. I don't know why. Unclear impact. There's also some basic statistical analysis I've done that's in the paper that does 1 and 2 year lags and takes a look at the relationship between some of this funding and some of the measures we can think of for civil society, like the NGO Sustainability Index. What else? Nations in Transit, the Civil Society Score. I have my own measure of nonprofit organizations in post-communist Europe. Freedom in the World, just take Freedom House generally. And what was interesting is that there was a positive and statistically significant correlation between the private and quasi-private funding flows and positive change in civil society and democracy. There was a negative and statistically significant relationship between the bilateral donors and multilateral donors and civil society and democratic change. And that's interesting for a number of reasons. One, because they're going in different directions, but also because one of the things I did at USAID was work with a group of academics to gauge the impact of U.S. democracy assistance. And one of the things that popped up was the positive impact of civil society funding. So actually what I think may have happened is they've captured, because these amounts are roughly the same, I think they've captured the impact of private foundation giving. And if everything was in there, we might see a very different result from that study. Finally, the nature and fate of the civil society that resulted from a lot of this. And this is something that's fairly speculative, and I'm just sort of throwing out. Let's take a look at the nature. The major funders are primarily USAID, private foundations, legacy foundations that are sort of public money and private foundation money. And if we add in sort of the Canada and UK funding, this is a very Anglo-American nature. This is an entrepreneurial advocacy organization, civil society that's being created. Okay, here's the problem. The EU accession money is largely state-oriented, and it's all social service provision, and the funding comes through ministries. That's a very different model of how civil society works with the state and works with citizens. So what's going to happen as the bilateral donors like USAID have left or leaving, and the private foundations are moving elsewhere, and you do have these legacy foundations, but the funding's relatively small. What is going to happen to sort of this civil society sector that's been created and has this very particular nature that no longer fits with the available funding context? And so I'm assuming there's going to be a fairly massive shakeout if it's not underway already. And so that's the fate issue. Going to the future, I mean, one of the things I'd like to do is redo this analysis in a much more sophisticated way, following the group of academics at the University of Pittsburgh that did the USAID study. And I'd like to fill in the gaps with Westminster Foundation and with UNDP data. UNDP is very active. It's an incredible hole in this data set, but you just can't get the information. And actually, I'd like to expand it globally. And to that end, I'm actually working with an organization, a research organization based partly at William & Mary and partly at Brigham Young, that's gathering project-level data on foreign assistance projects. And the conversation began because I'm one of about 3 people that know in detail what happens at USAID and what happened in the last 15 years. But also because I can do the private foundation side. And so that's being funded by Gates and Hewlett, and we're hoping to come up with more money to expand this and include this very important set of actors as well. So I'm done. I don't need your 3 minutes, time.
Thanks very much. Our next speaker is Peter Gross. He's a director and professor of the School of Journalism and Electronic Media and the College of Communication and Information at the University of Tennessee. He's speaking on East European media. So thanks very much for coming.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Good. If I seem jet lag, it's only because I am. I just got back
Have a
late
special
Sunday from
appreciation
Eastern
for
Europe.
coming, yeah.
But thank you for the invitation. I always like coming back here. My concern over the years has been with mass media evolution in Eastern Europe and how it might or might not aid its transition and transformation. And this is what I'm here to talk about today. It's an ongoing project, by the way. It has changed to some extent, and the end of my presentation suggests how my approach or my interest might have changed. We all know that the mass media have been considered central to the changes that have occurred in Eastern Europe after 1989. And one of the way that this importance has been exemplified, of course, is by the amount of aid that has been given to the development of mass media and to journalism in East Central Europe. Despite the aid that has been given and ultimately the pressure that has been brought by the European Union for changes in the Central and Eastern European media, the effects that this media have had on the democratization process has been both indirect and to a great degree unwitting. And at times perhaps even counterproductive, given the fact that the media exemplified some of the worst traits that one could find in a democracy, and that is they were examples of corruption, they were examples of bickering, of intolerance, of instability, of partisanship, and other negative traits. So EU's eastward expansion did not help as far as I'm concerned, and now it can't help, and I would like to tell you why. But before we do that, for those of you that may not be familiar with Eastern Europeans media, let me give you a very brief, the briefest of introduction to this particular institution. With the caveat, of course, that these are generalizations and that there are indeed some differences between countries in the region. The mass media in East Central Europe are essentially controlled by politicians, manipulated by politicians, by political parties, by economic interests and exigencies, and whoever else owns them for purposes that are divorced from the function they should indeed serve, and that is to inform people and to offer a variety of points of view, and in that order, by the way, and be responsible to their audiences and to the requisites of a democratic dialogue. Social responsibility is a guiding professional principle for the very special institution of mass media and democracy is truly terra incognita in Central and Eastern Europe. Journalism is highly politicized, opinion-driven, partisan, particularly on controversial issues, and those issues that are of personal interest to the owners, who often wear several hats, including that of a politician, or at the very least, a partisan on behalf of a particular political party. Cronyism of all sorts is ever present. Political and economic interests have a definitive symbiotic relationship. Tabloidization is common, including the tabloidization of politics. Most media outlets are economically unstable, making them a perfect target for a sugar daddy who has a particular agenda in mind for the media platform he or she is willing to support. The mass media are under relentless attack from those who oppose a particular political stance one or another outlet has taken on, and of course by state institutions. There are threats, both physical and legal, made against media and their journalists. There is sometimes censorship exercised by owners, and most often self-censorship by all who work for the owners. There are continuous attempts to control or manipulate national audiovisual boards or councils that essentially oversee the operation of broadcasting. And there is a consolidation of the media concentration phenomenon, and this has become particularly problematic in the last few years. There is a lack of political will to modify laws addressing the functions of public radio and television, to assure that they are truly independent and truly public in nature. There's a lack of protection of and privacy for news sources. There are indeed some laws in some countries in Central Europe that address privacy and the protection of news sources, but essentially they're simply ink on paper, and they are interpreted in such a way that they're really kind of useless, not to mention that the judiciaries in Eastern Europe are simply not independent themselves. There is an absence of bona fide ethical codes and a means and willingness to enforce them. These problems that the mass media have, vis-a-vis their so-called incorporation into the EU, or the EU's media world, if you will, are directly related to problems of democratization, and by extensions to the problems that democratization has in the region, particularly the type of democratization that is asked of them by the EU. As post-communist nations moved along in the process that led them to EU accession, they asked themselves the following question: what democratic standards should post-communist society seek to apply, and by what criteria should they assess their own progress and be judged by others? East and Central European countries simply could not answer that question, but it was not their fault. And as things are now, they should not have worried about it. The EU's impact on democratization in Central and Eastern Europe has, from my point of view, been limited. The demand that the newly liberated former communist countries imitate their Western brethren was stymied by the EU and by three issues that the EU has yet to deal with. Number one, a set of unclear democratic standards. They talk about European values, but I have no clue what European values may be, and I am a European. Two, lack of democracy within the EU institution, and examples of illiberal democracies among its members, and I'm talking about Western European members. And three, few mechanisms to impose standards. So, as the EU moved eastward, the mass media institutions had to answer a similar question as the nations in which they function. If we are asked to imitate Western European mass media, which one or ones are we supposed to pick as a model? Which values are to be the basis of our own mass media, and how do we impose these values? They could not answer the questions. Imitating the Western mass media was both possible and impossible, in fact. Let me explain. Few of the Western European mass media institutions, their legislative, ethical support, and their ethos are paragons of democracy supporting institutions and professionalism. Media legislation in Western Europe is either outdated, for example, the French are operating under a French press law that was enacted in 1881, a couple of years before I was born. Their restrictive provisions are said not to be applied, but they are on the books. Or this legislation is outright counterproductive to a free media, and therefore I think it's hypocritical to suggest that they be imitated. For example, when Romania reinstated press offenses in the criminal code, only weeks after joining the EU in January of 2007, Romania's Supreme Court cited rulings made by the EU Court of Human Rights and similar defamation laws in France, Germany, and Italy to justify its position, highlighting, as far as I'm concerned, the fact that Western Europe the supposed bastion of democracy and free media and openness and press freedom, has not yet decriminalized all press offenses. EU legislation and its rules say little about media freedom. For that matter, they say little about corruption and cronyism. So what are we supposed to do in Eastern Europe? Imitate Berlusconi's Italian media? Last but not least, the fact that so much of Western European media is politicized and partisan makes it less than a good model for change for Eastern European and Central European journalism, considering particularly that they've already doing that. Eastern European journalism has always been politicized. It has always been literary. It has always been partisan. And part of it, by the way, has always been Francophone. So now what are we supposed to do in Eastern Europe? Imitate the French press? The EU's extension eastward has included Western European media corporation expanding into Eastern Europe. And we thought that that, coupled with the pressure that the EU was exerting in the region, perhaps changes would occur. But these Western corporations that have gone into Eastern Europe and Central Europe have done nothing to improve mass media in the region or its journalism. They've essentially gone native, trying to make some money essentially by arguing that, of course, they need to sell the kind of a product that Eastern Europeans are used to. They have increased the technological endowment of media in the region. So, to some extent, when it comes to the mass media, among other institutions, of course, the worst thing for Eastern Europe and for its media was accession to the EU. Because now any basis for pressuring Eastern Europe and the Eastern European media to change is gone. The EU is not going to turn around and say to Bulgaria or to Romania or to Poland or to Hungary or to the Czech Republic, you're not meeting standards, we're going to kick you out. Because, in fact, they would have to start with Italy and Germany and France and some of the founders of the EU.
About 3 minutes left.
Oh, about 3 minutes? Okay. So, 3 minutes. All right. I think what it comes down to, both in terms of research as well as in terms of policy and how to aid the transformation in East Central Europe, is to look at culture. Culture needs to change in Eastern Europe before democracy can really set in. That is, as we all know, path-dependent. It is a slow process. The argument that you change institutions and therefore you can change culture may be valid, but only to a very small extent. At the moment, we are seeing institutions in Eastern Europe that very much resemble institutions in Western Europe, yet they work entirely different, with completely different results. It's like having two McDonald's side by side. One serves hamburgers and the other sushi, and it just does not work. So I think I'll close with a quote from Umberto Eco, which I think is very pertinent to my closing here. He said that even though political regimes can be overthrown and ideologies can be criticized and disowned, behind the regime and its ideology, there is always a way of thinking and feeling, a group of cultural habits or of obscure instincts and unfathomable drives. And I think this should be our starting point, not only for research, but also for any policy making. in regard to Eastern Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our final speaker on this panel is Lynn Tesser, who's currently assistant professor in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the International University of Sarajevo. She will speak on how does EU accession affect areas that have experienced ethnic cleansing. And thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Can everyone hear me? Looks like it. Okay. First, thanks very much for the Wilson Center to invite me today. I've come all the way from Sarajevo. I've started teaching there in September at a new international university that's in English language. It's called the International University of Sarajevo, with the intention, among other things, of continuing research that I began with my dissertation. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. It was focused more on Central Europe, particularly Poland and the Czech Republic, but I think these cases offer some ideas for looking at the Balkans. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Poland, Czech Republic, and then shift to the Balkans. The key question, as Nita just read off of the program, that I'm focused on is really the question of what is the impact of European integration on areas that experienced ethnic cleansing. And what continues to fascinate me all these years after I began my dissertation research is, in a sense, the replacement of the initial recipe for peace at the end of the Second World War in Europe, in Central and Eastern Europe, was to try and create ethnically homogeneous nation states. In particular, by the Allies approving of the population expulsions of Germans from the border areas of Poland and Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland. So the previous recipe to bring long-term peace was really forced population movements to try and create ethnically pure nation states. Now that has been replaced by a completely different recipe for peace, which is European integration, in a sense bringing down borders for free movement, allowing ethnic intermingling, and so on and so forth. So I'm fascinated with this contradiction. So I ask you to consider this question, not only because of my personal fascination, but I think there's reason to be concerned about European integration in areas that experienced ethnic cleansing because of the issues raised by ethnic cleansing, and particularly forced population movements, can lead to questions about ownership, about who owns homes, property, land, these sorts of things. And that can also ultimately lead to questions about sovereignty, or in other words, which states should ultimately govern areas that experienced ethnic cleansing. So, and this is exactly what happened after the end of the Cold War, and as states like the Czech Republic and Poland prepared to join the EU, with the emergence of German expellee organizations in Germany as well as Austria, had a lot of influence around this time, and so much so that initially the German and Austrian governments made compensation for expellees a condition of joining the EU. Of course, this was dropped later on, but initially that was the demand. So the power of German expellee organizations ultimately created strains in Czech-German relations as well as Polish-German relations. They were a key factor, I would argue, along with pressures coming from the EU to liberalize emerging land markets, that led to foreign land ownership being a key issue of concern around the time of EU accession negotiations. Such that the Polish government initially demanded an 18-year period, waiting period, before EU citizens, and particularly Germans, could buy property, in particularly agricultural land in Poland. So 18 years, I think it was 10 years in the case of other candidate states. So, foreign land ownership really became an issue, even 50 years after the German expulsions, when, only after 1989 could this issue be openly dealt with. Now, just as I think an interesting thing to observe from this period is that the Sudeten Germans really were, I think, more a powerful force in terms of organizing to pressure the Czech government. I had a couple of reasons for why they were more ultimately organizationally successful. And if we compare the German minorities in Sudetenland with Poland, German minorities in Sudetenland had been there for a lot longer time and tended to be in more concentrated communities as compared to Germans in Poland. Also, I think that Sudeten Germans had a stronger claim to their former property based on the differences in the way that Germans were expelled from the Czech Republic and Poland, even though both Czechs and Poles took it upon themselves to expel their German neighbors at this time. In the case of the Czech population, it was more the Czech population. Also, the Czechoslovak government passed the Beneš decrees legitimating the expulsions, which also denied refugees rights of protection for a time. And there was really no parallel in the Polish case, where the Polish government officially set out something like the Beneš decrees to authorize the expulsion of the Germans. So I would argue that this made it not surprising that the Sudeten Germans, were more organizationally successful at this time. So I've spent a little bit of time talking about the Czech and Polish cases. I think now, we can consider the question of what will happen in the Balkans, because, an area that wants to join the EU has also experienced ethnic cleansing. Now I'm just going to talk about a couple of things, I think, reasons we might have to worry, but the good news is that I don't think that we're going to see as much contention as we did during the EU accession period of Poland and the Czech Republic. Now, a reason to worry is, of course, that the Balkans will not enjoy the luxury of this 50-year period of Soviet domination in which everyone could basically get used to the huge demographic changes that followed the German expulsions, and also, the recentness of ethnic cleansing there also might make it more likely for sovereignty to be questioned over certain areas. But I think there are a few reasons to worry less about in the case of the Balkans. First of all, a key difference between the Balkans in the 1990s and Poland and the Czech Republic experiencing ethnic cleansing in the late, towards the end of the Second World War and early Cold War period, is that the Balkans did not experience three reversals of power in very quick succession like Poland and the Czech Republic did. They went from either German or Austrian control to Polish or Czech control, back to German control, and then back to Czech and Polish control. So I think the reversals of power really mattered to a great extent, kind of fueled this sense of wanting to get revenge that I don't think that we're seeing in the Balkans. Another key difference is that who owns which property, I think, is clearer in the Balkans than it is certainly in the case of Poland, which, as you may remember, the Polish-German border shifted westward by 150 kilometers. So Poland got, this former German territory, and basically the Polish government allowed Poles to lease this property, even though they weren't officially owners of it. And as far as I know, the research I had done on this, I finished in 2004, but at that time, the Polish government had not made any rulings as to the official status of these properties, and so we have Poles leasing this former German property, German expellees mobilizing to try and get it back or to get some kind of form of compensation. So I think this uncertainty over who owns which property in the former German areas of Poland only added to this contention that I just described. Another reason to be more optimistic about the Balkans is that since the end of the conflict, refugees have the right of return. They've been encouraged to return, even though certainly in some cases they don't feel safe doing so, or they've just adjusted to where they've moved to, things like that. And finally, some people have told me that there have been numerous television programs in the Balkans where people talk about what it was like to go back to their former homes and how their neighbors treated them. So I guess this issue has been dealt with in the media, and this is what I've heard secondhand. I haven't learned Bosnian well enough to really understand it myself. But in any event, there are some good reasons to think we won't really see a repeat of the Polish and Czech case. Now, the last segment of my talk today, I really wanted to express some concern that we don't treat Bosnia like previous Central and East European countries, because I think it's quite different, if only because with Bosnia we have at the same time these competing visions for peace. You know, Dayton, in a sense, is the old vision of peace, of trying to separate the nationalities, you know, for security reasons and others. Whereas, you know, Bosnia trying to join the EU is all about bringing down borders and allowing free movement. So we have both recipes kind of in conflict, you know, in the case of Bosnia. But, you know, from what I understand, the conditions in Bosnia would not be very conducive, say, for a repeat of the case of Vladimir Mečiar being voted out of Slovakia. And you know, as I remember this case, Slovaks were convinced that they needed to vote out Mečiar in order to be able to join the EU. And I just can't see that we would have the same thing happening in Bosnia. As I understand it, politicians mainly pursue their own self-interest. The only reason to get into politics is to make money for yourself, and not for any sense of doing anything for the public good. So there's the problem of politicians not being held accountable. They're not representative of the public. And on the second side of the equation is that citizens are very passive, have very little sense of being able to change things, and feel more or less like helpless pawns at the mercy of these, you know, these powerful people running the country. So this is kind of a bad mix, unfortunately, that I think is somewhat unique compared to previous Central and East European entrants. So I unfortunately have to conclude my presentation. Do I have about 3 minutes? Is that, you know, as I was preparing this talk, I was really wanting an idea, to come up with an idea of what to do. And the only thing I can, you know, communicate, you know, it's nothing at all original, is I've been very happy to see more U.S. engagement in Bosnia, especially with the Biden visit, which got lots of media coverage. So that was very nice to see. Just in talking to my students and other people hold, you know, the few people that I talk with, hold out hope that the U.S. and the Obama administration can kind of restart things, because I don't think people are very hopeful about the EU right now. But at the same time, if the U.S. is able to do something, it still doesn't tell people how they should be involved in politics, you know, in some way to try and change situations. So in the same sense, you know, I should have started with this Umberto Eco quote. You know, there's some deep cultural practices going on as well that I don't fully understand, because I've only been there since September. So I wish I had more thoughts about that. But it's certainly of concern to me, you know, as a teacher, trying to figure out how to show people how to take more initiative in doing things. So, so in any event, if you invite me back next year, maybe I'll have a few more ideas on what to do. But ultimately, I guess the main message is that, you know, on the positive side, I think that the after effects of ethnic cleansing, as Bosnia attempts to join the EU, I think we won't see as much contention as we did surrounding the German expellees and the Polish and Czech governments. But nevertheless, Bosnia is such a riddle, because it's ethnically divided, but yet trying to join the EU. So, and you know, has this political situation where it's very difficult to get politicians to be held accountable. So, in any event, I look forward, hopefully, to come back next summer and having some more news.
No, we
Thank
hope
you.
so too.
Okay.
Thank you very much to all three of you. I'm looking around the room, and I'm glad to see that I don't see anybody here from the Commission delegation who would probably accuse me of stacking the decks against the EU with this panel. But in order to sort of explain a little bit, the EU, you know, has, I mean, these three papers basically show where the holes are in the accession process. Many people think, you know, the assumption is that, you know, things have improved. But when you look at the specific tools that the EU has, they do seem to be lacking. And this isn't to say, I think, that the EU is bad at this or the EU doesn't care about these things. I think that people within the EU do deeply care about these things, but the difficulty of sort of getting agreement within the EU countries on these issues, which are very contentious, even in individual states, let alone at a sort of a larger scale, has been difficult. And the idea, I think, is to bring the U.S. back into paying attention to these issues, not only in the Western Balkans, which is the agenda today, but also moving back to Central and Eastern Europe and continuing with programs that we've had so far. I also would like to mention that this meeting is being webcast, or it's being taped for a webcast that we will now put on a website that's going to be launched in the coming weeks on specifically targeting information on the EU enlargement process to the Western Balkans. So all of these three presentations certainly show, where new focus ought to be made in the process of creating innovative solutions to bring the Western Balkans in. Because in fact, it's going to be more difficult. The Western Balkans, in particular Bosnia, is not at the level that Romania and Bulgaria was when they started the process, let alone Czech Republic or Poland. So this process will be more difficult and complicated. We have about 10 minutes left for questions. We'll also have a larger session at the end after Ron Linden's talk to sort of really analyze these things and bring out questions from all three panels. So if you ask a question, please wait till you're identified and keep it brief so that there's enough people, and please wait for a microphone to come to you. I see Yanis in the back. Yeah.
Yes, hi. My question is for Peter Gross. In relation to ownership questions, media ownership questions, we have seen several efforts to legislate to avoid the Italian example of Berlusconi owning 85 or whatever percent it is. Some of them do not allow cross-media ownership. So if you own 2 newspapers, you can own a radio, but you cannot have a TV, or there are percentages or quotas put there. But often those legal acts are challenged in the courts. So you have this constant battle between free market concepts. If I have and I want to and I'm doing well, I can own 10 stations. Who are you telling me you cannot? Are you familiar with any successful example of such legislation you could recommend? And a second small question, because I was not sure about your use of the term politicized. Can you mention a major U.S. news channel, TV news channel, that in your view is not politicized?
No, let me tackle that one first. So we got that out of the way. No, I don't know of any legislation in Eastern Europe and Central Europe that has been successful in assuring the lack of monopolies. And partly the problem, of course, is one of transparencies. If you look across East Central Europe, we're not quite sure who owns the media. There are front people or front agencies that appear to own certain media outlets, but behind them there is some other individual. And often that individual surfaces during a time of crises. So monopolization continues on a number of different levels. I think that the fact that the Western European media or media corporations are still in Eastern Europe, despite the fact that, in my judgment, they haven't done much for Eastern European media, that is actually good. I do applaud that. I think that's part and parcel of opening up.
In the back, please also identify yourself for...
Hello, my name is Ina Novozelskis. I'm a scholar here for a few months at the Wilson Center, and I didn't realize the full topics that you were going to be discussing, but they are so pertinent to my life in the 1990s, because I worked both for the European institutions and the U.S. institutions in media assistance programs, and often wondered what happened and what kind of success there was. And from your presentations, it sounds like the evaluation process may be something that has come to grips, that there is finally a way of evaluating, which there wasn't at the time. But I wanted to offer a few thoughts. Having worked for European institutions, let's say the European Journalism Center, the European Institute for the Media, and so on and so forth, in those days there was great tension between what they were doing and what the U.S. was doing on the ground. There was a lot of lip service being paid that we should work together. But in actuality, none of that happened, because the agenda really was to push one's own organizations, one's own. Okay, then there was another kind of tension. The tension was, what kind of media assistance is the kind that is necessary? Do you need journalism education? Do you need legal reform? Do you need loans for media outlets to be able to buy machinery? Those who were involved in journalism training, and I was one, believed in programs like ethics. Everybody hated ethics programs, because if you go into an ethics program, you're being taught how to be good by outsiders who don't speak your language, don't know your culture, don't know the price you're going to pay for doing good journalism, and so on and so forth. And they got a bad rap, because consultants would come from around the Beltway. They would have something in their portfolio. They'd come to Bulgaria one day, the Baltics the next. They didn't know the difference between the two. I remember having to bring in students at the university in Vilnius, where I was teaching journalism, and someone was there from Sweden to talk about press law, and I had to gather them around to come go, because it's impolite if it's an empty room. But the truth of the matter is the press law in Sweden had nothing to do with the press law in Lithuania or the conditions in Lithuania. So there were different, and then from the, let's say, recipient side, sometimes you could have Westerners come in who would come and give very good ideas, but you didn't want somebody else giving your ideas. You wanted to have your own ideas, and that's not necessarily backward and not necessarily nationalistic to say so. And so I think I'll stop there. But these are some of the issues that I remember came up.
Do you want to respond to? I think that part, no?
Well, I think every word you said is absolutely true. I mean, this has been said before. Unfortunately, we were surprised by the events of 1989. We shouldn't have been, of course, but we were. And I'm not going to go into why. This is not the place. But we were surprised and not ready, and very naive as to what can be done and should be done in regard to transforming mass media, at least. I'm not talking about other institutions. I've done a lot of the things that you have described in regard to training and aiding media develop in Eastern Europe. One of the things that I've argued at the very beginning of the 1990s, that our target is just simply wrong. If we're going to change media and journalists, we need to talk to politicians, to civil society groups, even starting to talk to high schoolers in regard to what they should look for in media and journalism, what they should demand, why, and so forth. Not many people listened to me, not that I expected them to, but they certainly didn't. They didn't disappoint. But that was my idea anyway. And then again, a question that to this very day remains unresolved. Is it really logical and reasonable to expect Eastern Europe, not only after 45 plus years of communism, but an even longer period, pre-communist period, where they didn't have any democracy, to simply make that journey to a working democracy within a few years? I always thought that was rather a misplaced hope and a misplaced target.
Thank you very much to our panelists. We are on a very tight schedule, so I have to cut off the discussion now. But let me introduce our next chair, who is Ivan Grdišić, our distinguished public policy scholar. He's a professor of political science at the University of Zagreb, and he's here for a few months. He's also the former Croatian ambassador to the U.S., and he will chair the next session. I invite everybody to come up also and take your place.
Take places.
Scholar here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. We have a very, and in my opinion, very interesting panel on specific issues and specific policies that we can learn in the Western Balkans of the new member states. And I found all of them very important. And in the previous conference that we had here, We talked exactly on agriculture, environment, and labor issues, and we will hear what the candidate countries can learn on that issues. My panel on the right is Yuson, Department of Anthropology, Harvard University, and she will speak about agriculture issues, very important. We can learn from Holland and in other countries how it works. Tracie Wilson, Director of Russian, East European and Eurasia Center, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign on environment. And Diana Eglidis, Economic and Power Labor Migration in Post-Accession Latvia, from Sociology, International Affairs, George Washington University here in town. And Steve Crowley, Labor, European Social Markets and Expansion of the EU, Professor of Politics at Oberlin College. And I want to waste too much time. We'll start by the order of our agenda today with Yuson from Harvard University. Please go ahead.
Thank you. This is actually a work in progress, and I have started this project with the support of the Woodrow Wilson Center. I was a fellow last year, and since then I have conducted some library and primary source resources, as well as 5 months of actual fieldwork in Bulgaria, participating in a wine harvest last summer up to winter. And that was also supported by the IREX Foundation for East European Studies. So I'm going to share with you a little bit of the preliminary findings. Nothing is actually done yet, and I'm actually heading back next week, back to the Balkans to finish this research. But basically, what I'm trying to do with this research is to learn what the impact of the agricultural reform or the new wine reform of European Union is on a marginal wine producer, but has always been a major wine producers in the world, such as Bulgaria, and how that the policy impacts actually the rebuilding of the Bulgarian wine industry. And I, as an anthropologist, I want to understand this whole process from the intimate perspectives of the wine producers. So I'm going to give you some micro perspective rather than the big macro analysis. So the big question for my question of this project was that Europe is faced with overproduction of wine, and that's where the title actually comes from. It has been characterized in the media as the problem of the wine lake in Europe. And there has been more competition from the New World as well. So how would a traditional yet dilapidated wine industry, such as Bulgarian wine industry, reposition itself after EU accession with its new resource to structural fund for agriculture and rural development? That was my big question. And would they actually benefit from it, or would it be any kind of negative impact because they are such a marginal players? I thought Bulgaria offers a very compelling case because of its proportionately high reliance on export sector, and is therefore more subjected to the international policy. So, traditionally, this is a very favorite and famous quote from a lot of Bulgarians, and many of the Balkan people might actually recognize that for themselves as well. In Bulgaria, it is rare for Bulgarians not to have vineyards. This is their favorite occupation. A peasant considers himself unhappy and feels ashamed if he does not have a vineyard. And even today, a lot of the Bulgarians own a small piece of vineyards due to the privatization and restitution process. And that's the real cultural backdrop that has to be actually understood in order to actually understand the implication of this larger policies on the restructuring process. So I'm giving you a lot of visuals because I'm back from the field and I have a lot of photo images, and it probably gives you a little more of the intimate perspective. This is a very modest Bulgarian peasant house, and as you can see, basically every village house has some wine arbors around the house, and it is not just for decorative purposes, but they actually utilize it for homemade wine and the infamous grape brandy, the Bulgarian rakia. So winemaking is a long tradition of Bulgaria, and arguably they are one of the first winemaking people in the world. So it should not be surprising to see that Bulgaria has a relatively large vineyards area, and almost all agricultural land also grows grapes. So traditionally, they have been actually divided into 5 major wine regions: the north, the east, the south, and the sub-Balkan region, as well as the southwestern region, which is bordering Greece. But with the EU accession, a lot of politics got involved, and because the new wine policy recognizes the origin, the protection of origin, they have actually been reduced to 2 major regions that is actually recognized as the original place. And that's been the north and the south. And a lot of the wine producers are quite unhappy about this kind of changes, because according to them, that really precludes them of becoming a very major player in the fine high quality wine category, because they claim that their uniqueness of their wine comes actually from the earth, and by making it into just 2 categories really doesn't give them the advantage of claiming their terroir concept. That's right. Yep. So when it comes to the Bulgarian winemaking tradition, by the end of World War I, 55% of Bulgaria's households grew wines and made wine, and the ownership was really around 0.2 to 1 hectare, which is a very small parcel of land. By 1970, Bulgaria's vineyards covered around 200,000 hectares. To give you a comparative perspective with the numbers, Napa Valley has planted vineyards about 18,000 hectares. So the whole Bulgaria has about 10 times more than the Napa Valley planted vineyards in terms of the numbers of the vineyards. At present, Bulgaria's vineyards cover around 120,000 hectares, with a share of 2% of the world market, and among the top 15 wine-producing countries. And again, this is due to their heavy emphasis on the export sector. So just to give you a little background on the Bulgarian wine industry, before socialism, the socialist revolution in 1944, the tradition was not really in the scale of an industry as such. People primarily made wine for themselves, and there is a long-standing homemade wine tradition that adds to the reason why there has been such a heavy emphasis on the export sector in Bulgaria. During socialism, industrialization took place, and development into hard currency earning export sector was really supported and led by the state. And serious market share is in the British and the German markets, and some of them were actually also in the American market. So for these various reasons, and of course we cannot forget the huge Soviet market that really was crucial for the Bulgarian wine industry. Now, after the collapse of socialism and the so-called post-socialist EU integration phase, there has been a very chaotic transition process with privatization. And it's regarding the land ownership and the slowness of the reform, and everything was tangled up. And then however, the pre-accession program of SUPPART, which is very well known for a lot of people who are dealing with the agricultural processes, offered actually new opportunity, and it was pretty positive because a lot of money did pour in. It did have some kind of visible effect on the restructuring process. Yet still it is unclear about how the concrete future strategy for the export sector actually looks like, especially given that the new money from the EU structural fund becomes available to Bulgaria. And there is also the tension between the industry and the state. They can't really figure out what their partnership as well as leadership is like. So there is this kind of huge tension between who will take the leadership role in actually rebuilding the image of the Bulgarian wine industry. Let me give you a couple of more cultural background on that. I mentioned earlier that Bulgaria is interestingly very heavy export-oriented, and that's due to mainly three factors. One is the improvement in wine processing with the industrialization process during the socialist government. And then the high levels of homemade wines that also attributes to more export wine. And the decrease of domestic wine consumption, that's been also pretty European trend, that the per person consumption level has been dropping to 1/3 of what it used to be in the 80s and the 70s. Also, the other interesting cultural aspect is Bulgarians seem to really, really love to make wine as much as consuming wine. So the emphasis, the cultural emphasis is really on the making process. So they are not, from the very everyday practice level, it really matters to them that they own a little piece of vineyard and they have their own grape and they can actually make the grape with it. So there are a lot of temptation to sell the land, and there are a lot of pressure also, political pressure to consolidate land and so on, but not everywhere has been very, very successful because of this kind of cultural attitude in my analysis. So let me give you a few more words on SUPPART, this pre-accession agriculture reform program. So with this program, what it does is basically improving the existing infrastructure, such as renovation of wine cellars and updating old machineries. And a lot of the wineries that were heavily developed during the socialist government has now this kind of sign in front of the wineries. This is one of the more successfully industrialized winery in southern Bulgaria, and it, the slide doesn't show you very clear visual, but it is actually very modern looking, and this is one of the positive effect of having this support funding from the EU accession program. This is the old picture of the Soviet developed wine barrel. This is actually cement, and inside is actually lined with glass. And here they have stored tons of wine. And you can see it's not really what we imagine with this kind of high, like luxury commodity of wine that we see in other places. Some might actually think this is another legacy of communism or socialism, but it is actually the legacy of EU structural fund, because this is the updated technology with the stainless steel tank. And this was also supported by this kind of support fund that gave them the chance to restructure what looked like this to this. This is also a renovated wine cellar. This is unused old barrels. That's definitely from the socialist era, and there is no way for them to actually reutilize this kind of infrastructure, and that's the negative side of the whole thing, because there was such an emphasis on the quantity of wine production rather than the quality, that there are a lot of this kind of infrastructure that is being totally unuseful and left in that form. So another thing that the support does is vineyard and creating new vineyards, and that's been also one of the positive effect for a lot of these new member states, because they were able to get funding to create more vineyards. And that sounds a little strange, probably, in the context of this overproduction of wine in Europe in general. But the whole logic was they used to have these vineyards. It's just that they were not tended for 20 years, about 10 to 20 years during the transition phase, and that's why they were allowed to create new vineyards. Of course, with the new wine reform that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, there has been restriction now to create new vineyards because of this overproduction problem. But part of the support was actually to allow this kind of new vineyards creation. And this is again a new, this is a winery that's been renovated. And this is what this apart money also gives is money to buy new machinery, update the machineries. This is the new vineyards. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the EU agriculture reform, the so-called wine reform that has created a huge public debate in Europe because of its emotional connection to wine as a cultural heritage of Europeans. So basically what the wine reform is all about is to regain market competitiveness in the global market for European wines. So far, they have been, European wines have been actually gradually losing a lot of market share due to the competition from the New World, such as Australia and Chile. And with the the reason why that was, losing this competitiveness is not just because the wine consumption level has been dropping, but also because there has been unnecessary bureaucratic procedures for these European wine producers that made it very uncompetitive in the global market. So one of the things that is being subjected to this wine reform is labeling simplification and standardization. So when you read wine labels, it will be as clear and simple as when we read labels from Napa or from Sonoma. Second is adoption of new winemaking technology. As technology improves, there has been a lot of innovative strategies of improving the quality of wine in the new world markets. But Europe has this very bureaucratic processes on getting permission that this is actually allowed to use as a new technology. And the number three is the biggest thing that really provoked a lot of tension for the wine producers, and that is also going to the heart of the agricultural policy in Europe in general. And that is when there is an overproduction and unsold product, right? EU has been always giving the subsidy to deal with this overproduced and unsold product. And in the case of wine, it's called the crisis distillation subsidy. So about 1.5 billion euros every year has been used to turn unsold wine into ethanol for fuel, to store it for the industry to get rid of in the future. So they are getting rid of this in order to make it more competitive. Fourth is restructuring of vineyards and variety conversion and grubbing up vineyards, which is another, very contentious matter for the Europeans, because grubbing up your vineyard, which is, linked with your cultural heritage, is becoming a very emotional thing. And lastly, it's about it's earmarked. Part of the money for the rural development is actually earmarked for wine development. So as you can see, actually, the producers mostly affected by this reform are actually the big players: France, Italy, Germany, and Spain. East European member states, and mainly these concerns Hungarians and Bulgarians and Romanians, who have a larger market share in terms of the wine production. They are not being directly negatively impacted by this kind of wine reform. But the problem arises actually from this reform has actually gone into effect from last August, so it's relatively new. But the problem arises that in the future, if the new member states cannot make them as market compatible as everybody hopes them to be, then they're going to actually suffer a lot from this kind of new wine reform that does not support any kind of crisis distillation or new cultivation of vineyards and so on and so forth. The other big issue is this untended vineyards. So there are lots of vineyards that are 100 years old, and they have absent owners, and they are not being tended, nor are they being sold. So this creates a huge problem for a lot of these people who do want to develop this industry. And that's where actually the role of the state becomes very, very important. Yet, because of the legacy of socialism, the state cannot actually jump in directly as the prominent leader for redeveloping this whole thing, nor can the industry kind of collectively align themselves and create some strong leadership in rebuilding this whole industry again. The other problem associated, that's my winemaker that I did closely work with, is that there are a lot of the labor forces are missing. They are migrating a lot for better pay. So even if there are so many vineyards that had to be attended in Bulgaria, they would actually go to France to pick the grapes because they pay better than Bulgaria. So there is this huge lack of labor forces that's going to be another big problem. So for giving you a little bit of a concluding remark, the impact of the new agriculture policy of Europe for small producers and marginal places like Bulgaria is coming down to really whether the subsidy can reach the small producers and large producers. This is not a new thing because even in the Western European countries, this has always been the big issue, whether it can actually trickle down to the small producers. Now, because this is such a chaotic phase in this in the case of Bulgarian wine industry, the large producers and small producers don't really consider themselves as partners, but more so like competitors, which is becoming a very interesting issue from the underground point of view, because what the small producers can do and the large producers can do are very different two things. And yet, to just have this kind of internal conflict makes it very unproductive for a successful implementation of the subsidy that comes down. The other thing is developing a constructive partnership between the state and the industry that I mentioned before, and forming a strong leadership within the industry. Like whether they like it or not, their image of the success and the image of the Bulgarian wine industry will be built around the national campaign. So what they really need to do is what they did in the 60s and the 70s to build some kind of positive image associated with the wine production for the global market. And this is also related to the fact that EU agriculture subsidy is ultimately managed through a national envelope, meaning it comes down from the EU to the national government, and they are the one who allocate the fundings. So again, this kind of partnership as well as delineation of the roles of each part, the state and the industry, becomes very important for the successful implementation of the agriculture policy. Finally, the EU wine reform doesn't address this issue of the lack of labor force at all, because it falls under the rubric of local needs. But this is actually not just a Bulgarian need. It is a problem for a lot of the wine-producing countries across Europe, that there has been a decrease of labor force. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next panelist is Tracie Wilson from Illinois, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and the topic is environment, and I will urge my panelists here to stick to the time frame, please, so that we don't take from coffee break too much. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to be speaking about EU accession and the environment in Poland, and Yuson's comments at the beginning made me think that probably I should mention that my dissertation fieldwork was supported by a Fulbright Hays Fellowship. And this is research that I did several years ago in the early 2000s, and I finished up my dissertation research in 2004, 2005. So I'm going to be talking about that and then kind of looking at some more recent developments in Poland. So I conducted fieldwork in 2000, 2001, and I was based in Bielsko-Biała, which is in south-central Poland. It's a city of about 170,000, and one reason I focused on this town was that there were a lot of nationally active environmental organizations in Bielsko-Biała. So one of my questions or interests was why there were so many in this town that wasn't really that big. And it turns out I found out pretty quickly that one major reason was that the original sort of parent organization that started in the 80s was essentially very dysfunctional or had dysfunctional leadership, so that people would be enticed by kind of their national reputation, would come there to work, and after a few years have a falling out or get frustrated and leave and start their own organization. So this happened a few times, so this is where these organizations all came from. And the other question that I was focusing on as I went into this research was what kind of relationships existed between activists and scientists and how much they collaborated. And this is more of a complex question that I won't go into now. I'll just say that, you know, they were not mutually exclusive by any means, that there was a lot of collaboration between environmental activists and scientists. But there were also a lot of factions, you know, within the activist and science communities of scientists who disliked or were highly critical of each other's work and approaches, and the same within activist circles. So this is a map of Poland, and Bielsko-Biała is down south of Krakow and Katowice in the mountains, and it's kind of a tourist hub for people traveling to the mountains. Central themes that came up in my research were the degree to which environmental issues were framed within larger cultural, social, political discussions about Poland's place in Europe and the world, or what it meant to be Polish during this time. And part of that was, again, this importance of the image of victimhood in Polish political and cultural discussions. And this harkens back to this image of Poland as the Christ of nations that was popularized by poet Adam Mickiewicz in the 19th century. And again, had this kind of resonated within environmental discussions in the sense that the West in particular owed Poland something. In the years leading up to the EU accession, that's the period where I was doing my research. So some of the key topics that seem to keep coming up were this idea that environmentalists were fundamentally anti-Polish, that they were seen as suspicious in Poland. And this has to do with several things, but one of them is that some of the more prominent visible groups tended to look to alternative religious traditions, which was seen as very suspicious among more traditional-minded Poles. Also, there was a sort of a deep-seated cynicism about people claiming to do work on behalf of the greater good, which I think is, you know, not uncommon in Eastern Europe in general, due in part to the communist history. But there were also some cases in Poland where sort of pseudo-environmental organizations claiming to be fighting for nature would, in fact, use their position to extract money from industries that were trying to develop. And there was a sort of a well-known case outside the city of Łódź where this happened. And although those cases were few and far between, they got a lot of publicity, and this image is still something that lingers in kind of the in Polish culture with regard to environmentalists, that they're not really, you know, fighting for nature, that they're really all about getting money for themselves. And again, this idea that there's this sort of resonance of image of the victim. So this carried over into, on both sides of the issues, environmental activists would be trying to, you know, in their publicity materials, use photographs where activists were being carried away by security. And then on the other side, people opposing environmental policy use this as another example of how Poland was under threat from outside influences, or from the EU, from alternative religions, or secularism in general. This idea that Poland is the kind of bastion of European Christianity comes into play a lot. And one of the key campaigns that the organizations I was studying were focused on in the late 90s and still into the 2000s was this issue of getting protection for wolves from hunting. The wolf in Poland functions as a kind of key symbol for the environmental movement, as I think it does in some other places as well. And activists were successful in passing legislation in the late 90s to have wolves protected. And part of this involved a kind of re-imaging campaign to try to depict wolves in a more sympathetic way than from sort of their traditional folk depiction of, you know, this treacherous predator that undermines humans and agricultural species. So, you know, this was kind of slogans you would hear about wolves that are, you know, wild is beautiful.
And Serbia, because of what were perceived as illegitimate privatizations that happened during these periods of extreme nationalism when class was very much downplayed. Unionization rates are also relatively high in Serbia and Croatia. About 40% which would make them, along with Slovenia, about the highest of any country in Eastern Europe. Without Slovenia, the rate in East Central Europe is 19%. Still, it's far from certain that Croatia and Serbia, let alone other West Balkan countries, can come close to replicating Slovenia's success for any number of reasons. But among them include the fact that, as I've said, many of these institutional choices have already been made. Again, in the case of Serbia and Croatia and others when there were other priorities, putting it that way. Also, a number of the West Balkan countries simply have smaller industrial sectors. They have much larger informal sectors, where even weak unions and weak labor laws really have no impact. So it may seem counterintuitive to say that strong unions and even labor protests would be helpful rather than counterproductive into a transformation out of communism. And it's certainly not sufficient. But I'd argue that the project of deepening and widening Europe is dependent on just that. Without the sense that unions and other institutions in these countries can provide a floor on wages, labor, and social policies, political support for further enlargement is just not likely to be there. Otherwise, it's hard to see what model any of these countries would have in common. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Steve. I have allowed a little bit more time, and I guess Nida is angry, but the audience and the panelists will have a shorter coffee break. And I thought that this was all very interesting. And just on a Slovenia note, very briefly from today, Slovenia is also officially in recession. Thank you very much. But thank you, panelists, for very, very interesting presentations. And we will hold our questions for the final session. And Martin wants us back at 3:30 after the coffee. And as Martin would say, let's join us in a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you very much.
Director of East European Studies here, and I'm happy to have this opportunity to host all these scholars who have been together with us. It's been a great idea that Nida and others had. Our topic here is external relations. I like that, for external relations. That sounds like somebody British wrote this. Did I clear this? I don't know. External relations. We never call it that. But anyway, it's an important topic. I think the common thought was that when these countries join the EU, one of the problems that would be over is our external relation problems. However, we see these countries torn between great forces. On one hand, United States and Russia. Still, there's a competition there, and Arista will go through that. Maybe more importantly, even you have them torn between the United States and the EU. You remember Mr. Rumsfeld and his contribution to world civilization with his old Europe and his new Europe. And then you have the issue of that Zsuzsa is going to be dealing with on majority-minority relations, because that's the big hope of the countries of the Balkans that are coming in, if they ever do get in, that the EU membership will help them get where they want to go or where they can go on that. So we'll see what the record is. In any event, so they'll have 15 minutes, not a second more. And we'll begin with Zsuzsa Csergo, who's Associate Professor at the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University in Canada, and for many years was professor here at GW University here in Washington. And her topic is the influence of EU accession on majority-minority relations. Zsuzsa, please.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you for inviting us. And where's Nida? Is she among the people who left? But I wanted to thank her personally also, because it's wonderful to have Nida and Martin here. It's almost like a home base for many of us who have been associated with the Wilson Center and this department. It's wonderful. And well, let me start by saying that I gave a subtitle to to this presentation, and it has a question mark at the end, and the subtitle is From Minority Protection to Minority Integration, question mark. And the reason I did that is that what I'd like to do is to raise some of the more big picture questions about how these countries have moved, and those that are maybe coming in as future new members through EU enlargement, move from the pre-accession mode and pre-accession phase to post-accession, and what the two phases have to do with each other. And so the big question that I have is whether we can actually claim that the EU helps these countries that become new EU member states from moving, helps them to move from the phase of where the big question is whether minorities should be protected, to the question of, well, how do we actually integrate minorities meaningfully into the political system if we still go on thinking of democracy as a political system that should create some kind of political community, right? And if we look at the way the EU itself has been approaching the question, it actually does seem like the new emphasis is clearly on minority integration. And as soon as the EU itself, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about how the EU relates to the other two institutions that have dealt with minority protection and minority rights issues, but as soon as the EU itself became more actively engaged in the process, minority integration became the primary issue and no longer the question of how do we lay down the framework and change citizenship laws and such. So that's the big question that I'm raising, whether we can actually talk about maybe the pre-accession phase as the phase when the primary question is how the EU can influence these countries to establish a framework, a set of institutions to accommodate minorities as well as the titular majority, to the question of how do we actually deal with integration in more meaningful terms. And what I'd like to say also is that as in my previous work, I have focused mostly on a couple of countries, Romania, Slovakia, Hungary, nation building, and especially language conflicts over language rights. And what I noticed, and many other people notice as well, is that language remains the most divisive issues in many of these countries, in the Baltics and elsewhere as well, because language does have to do with the question of cultural reproduction and whose culture is going to be reproduced, and not just language in terms of a means of communication, but what language carries, the national stories that the language carries, the literature and the historiography and the geography, and who names the mountain and who names the river. So language clearly, and I'm very happy to see this because I'm not going out of business, right? Because language continues to be very salient in many of these countries, even though they have now successfully graduated into the group of consolidated democracies. But as we talk about the problems, significant problems involved with EU accession and the influence of the EU, in recent years, most of the studies that have come out are quite negative, almost turning into cynical. In my previous work, I was also claiming that no, it's really not the EU. Anything good that comes out, it's not the EU's doing, it's not external influence, but it's the domestic bargaining. And it's the agency, I still claim that, it's the agency of the majority and minority political elites, and I don't mind saying this, I know there are anthropologists here as well, that political elites matter a great deal, especially when it comes to creating institutions, laying out the foundations, the framework, and bargaining. And that these political elites, majorities and minorities, have had a great deal of significance, agency as we call it in the field, but that they are very significant. But Now that many of the studies that focus on the EU are so negative and turning into cynical, I'm actually becoming a fan of the EU. So I want to say that I'm becoming a fan of the EU. And so what I'd like to, if anything emerges from this in terms of maybe an argument, what it will be is a claim that there's a reason why EU influence seems to have been ad hoc, more reactive than proactive. And the main reason is that, especially when it comes to minority protection and questions of majority-minority relations, and the main reason is not only that there were no, and there are no standards in Western Europe, in the established democracies of Europe, that could translate into policies, a coherent set of minority policies, but also because there's great variation on the other side, at the other end. That those of us, I'm a comparativist, and we like to see countries that are comparable. We like to find the patterns. We like to claim that nothing is unique and everything is comparable. And at some level that is true, but at the same time we also have to recognize that there were great significant differences between the issues that had to be resolved in these countries. And so the way I moved from those few countries, Romania, Slovakia, and Hungary, to a broader comparative study research that I'm doing now, is that I decided to incorporate at least two of the countries up north, Estonia and Lithuania. And the reason, Dinah, that I'm not including Latvia in this project, that by the way is funded by the Canadian Social Science and Citizen Humanities Research Council, I think I have to say that, is that Latvia is an outlier because the minority is so large. And it's very difficult to compare it to some of the other cases where you have a 7% or even 10% minority. So so Latvia is not systematically included in this, but instead Estonia and Lithuania, and still Romania and Slovakia, and also Hungary and the Czech Republic, because I decided to completely go out of my turf and also incorporate some comparison with the way Roma as minorities in the Czech Republic and Hungary have been using the EU as a framework, or how the EU as a framework has been trying to influence mobilization and political participation among the Roma. Because the question is, now that all of these countries have graduated and have become consolidated democracies supposedly, how are they now addressing this issue of minority integration, and what explains the great variation across these cases? And so what I'd like to do today very briefly, because I'm not going to have a lot of time obviously, is to just make a few points about the pre-accession period and then raise those issues about the post-accession period, and then hopefully in the discussion we can address them, at least some of them. But so the first one about the pre-accession period is that, as I said, the big problem, everyone knows that minority protection became, the reason why minority protection became such an important aspect of EU enlargement was regional security. So it was really regional security and state stability that raised the issue of minority protection to such a prominence at the beginning of the 1990s, and turned Europe as a region that has currently the most intensely institutionalized minority norms framework. There's no other region in the world that has the density of international minority rights connected, minority protection connected documents like Europe. So that's something to keep in mind. And it was security that made it happen. But then there's widely shared agreement in the scholarship that the European strategy lacked coherence, and that the emergence of any coherence in this field was severely limited by the absence of standards in the Western European cases. And all of that is true, but at the same time, we also have to recognize that while they were trying to use the European framework to tame nationalism and create frameworks in those countries that provide for some kind of minority accommodation, at the same time, simultaneously, these norms were coming out. So it was the process was simultaneous and very complicated at both levels. And as I said, conditions, the issues that had to be resolved in the candidate countries varied greatly. So how did the EU deal with this problem? And the way they dealt with the problem was that they simply delegated it to the two other institutions, the Council of Europe and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And they have to, it's not surprising, they have to do so because the EU itself lacked the instruments. And so what kind, because there was no, and there still is no minority acquis. And so even when you have the framework of EU conditionality, in order to actually make it work, and everyone knows that the EU was successful only when it used active leverage. Well, how do you use active leverage when you don't have a minority acquis, right? Can you create a minority acquis? No, you cannot, because the 15 states do not have, I mean, there's such a, everyone knows about the spectrum. So can you actually, acquis means policy level standards. You cannot have policy level standards in minority protection, especially minority rights. And so what could they do? They delegated it to the Council of Europe and the OSCE. And so they came up with two levels, actually three levels of instruments. And one is to create the norms of acceptable, appropriate behavior. And so those were the documents. And the Council of Europe was primarily in charge of creating those documents. And the two documents that became the most important in this field, in this area, are by the Council of Europe, the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities, and the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages. And so those became the two primary documents that formulated the norms of appropriateness. And then beyond the norms of appropriateness that were, of course, very generic and broad, they had two other instruments, and those were assessment, which is monitoring, and that was primarily the OSCE through the creation of the High Commissioner for National Minorities, who paid visits to these countries, to the capitals, and also had these short-term missions and field offices. And then also the EU, toward the end, the Commission, when it started issuing the regular reports after 1997, became involved in the business of assessment. And the third was diplomacy, or a version of it, I don't know how to call it. Some people call it quiet diplomacy, which the OSCE High Commissioner's Office was very significantly involved in. And so these were the only instruments that they had. There wasn't very much else that they could do. So what I'm claiming now is that it wasn't that minority protection was not important for the EU, but they simply lacked other instruments, and it wasn't possible to create an acquis. So this is what they did. So why were the issues different? And I will just briefly say that one primary reason why the issues at the receiving end were so different was that if there is one important, consistent principle in European norm and practice in the domain of majority-minority relations, it has to do with the fundamental assumption that historic inheritance matters, that majorities have an a priori right to the state, nobody questions that, but in terms of the minority groups, historic groups have more rights and right claims than non-historic groups. In Western Europe, this translates into the issue of historic national and ethnic minorities versus immigrants. In Central and Eastern Europe, that was not the case because non-historic groups were not immigrants yet, because these countries were not and still are not as attractive to immigrants as countries in the West. And so because of this, the same principle, and this is a fundamental principle in Europe, majority-minority relations, that inheritance matters, that historic rights are much more weighty than non-historic rights. And so because of this, the states in the Baltic had a different set. They formulated their relationship to the minority in different terms, and therefore they classified the Russian-speaking minorities as settlers, not as minorities. So they did not qualify in the minds of the dominant majority policymakers. They did not qualify for minority rights, really, because they were settlers. And the policies reflected this. They were actually trying to encourage Russians to leave. Whereas in the cases where the majority is classified, these were not formal classifications, of course, but the way they conceptualized and actually formalized in policies the relationship between the minority and the state. So where that was based on historic rights, like in the case of the Hungarian minorities in Romania and Slovakia, there the question of citizenship rights did not even come up. So they had very different issues to deal with. The Roma. Nobody considers the Roma as historic. They are historic. They are non-territorial historic. They have been there for centuries. But in the minds of the policymakers who design policies that have to do with the relationship between the state and the minority, these are significant issues. So I'm just going to have to finish and just now say that, that now that these countries laid down certain foundations that differ based on the way majorities conceptualize the relationship between minority and the state, actually the post-accession process is conditioned by what they did at the beginning of the process, and integration is also going to be conditioned by what they did at the beginning, the foundational phase. I'm going to just stop there.
Thank you, Zsuzsa. Okay. Next will be Julia Gray, who's Assistant Professor at Department of Political Science at the University of Pittsburgh, who will be talking about fiscal policy in the new EU.
No, I will not.
No.
I don't think that's what I'm supposed to be talking
All right.
Thank you.
At Economics.
At Pittsburgh, we do whatever we want.
Yes.
That's right. It's fast and loose.
Anyway, difficult subject.
Right. Math is hard. Oh, no, wait. I need the magic clicky thing. That's the technical term. Let me just see. Oh, yep, there we go. Okay, back to the thing. Thanks, first of all, to the Wilson Center for having everybody out, and to Marty and Nita especially for their organizational skills. So, yeah, what I'm going to talk about is, as the title implies, market perceptions of new EU members and candidate countries as well. And what my research looks at sort of broadly, just that you know that I'm not just throwing some stuff up here, is what do international organizations do, and how would we know if they do what we think they do? And there is no shortage of literature in political science and in other disciplines as well about the things that membership in international organizations are supposed to do. They're supposed to promote cooperation through repeated interaction of actors that belong to those organizations. And if you extend that logic a little bit further, that would mean that they would promote sort of regularized behavior, right? That if countries join an international organization together through a variety of processes, through, like I say, interaction or through resolving disputes, even sort of low-level socialization, just having coffee together all the time, countries will start to sort of act like one another. That can also be because of policy reform that these organizations promote. So you're supposed to notice convergence, essentially. Once countries join international organizations, they're supposed to start to behave similarly. And so how would we know if that were to happen? How could we measure that? Well, you can think about it from an investment perspective. If you're an investor, which fewer and fewer people are these days, I guess, you'll sort of observe countries circulating out in the world, particularly maybe developing countries that you don't know a lot about and you can't pronounce the names of. All the Eastern European countries probably look the same to you. How would you know if these countries, how would you have a rubric for classifying these countries? Well, one thing that you might think would be that countries that were joining the EU were going to look more like countries that you already sort of have a mental map for. And so then what you would expect to see would be that countries that were on the road to EU accession were going to have a lower cost of borrowing on international markets than countries that aren't. What that essentially means is that the interest rates charged to these countries to borrow money on international markets would be lower than in countries that weren't negotiating with the EU, where the risk levels associated with those countries were going to be higher. So that's sort of the theoretical and empirical framework for what I'm going to talk about today. What I'm going to be looking at and showing to you is the risk perception of countries in the eyes of financial markets. So I'm not talking about foreign direct investment, somebody wanting to build like a Nike plant, in Germany versus Slovakia versus Ukraine. What I'm looking at is the much maligned fast money, or sort of hot money, and sovereign debt issued from these countries and traded on international markets. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. And so there are two examples that I'm going to sort of start us out with, just to get a sense of what I'm going to be talking about today. So one of them was Hungary in September 2006. This was, a sort of remarkable presaging of the woes to come. But what happened at this time was that, the EU had sort of been looking at Hungary's books well after, by the way, they'd become members, a good year and a half or so, 2 years, I guess, and suddenly found that there were these big-time discrepancies in the books. Specifically, the Hungarians had failed to mention, construction of several roads and many sort of budget misallocations. And what ended up happening was that the Hungarian government totally threw up their hands and admitted that they had basically falsified the vast majority of their figures in the budget. The prime minister at the time, Ferenc Gyurcsány, was actually, a tape was leaked of him sort of admitting to his party, we've really screwed up. No country in Europe has screwed up as badly as we have. This is all a pack of lies. And so this was a big scandal. Hungarians like their scandals, and so you saw a lot of people rioting in the streets, things burning, etc. The other event that I want to contrast this with is Croatia's proposed opening of talks with the European Union. So Croatia had for several years been trying to make very visible signals that it was on the right track in terms of policy reform. And so, in fact, in December of 2004, Günter Verheugen, who was the enlargement chief at the time, announced that in the spring, Croatia was going to officially open negotiations with the EU. Everybody was very excited. Verheugen actually was quoted as saying at the time that Croatia's economic and political situation, economic situation, I should specify, was in fact a lot better than many of the countries that were already in the EU. And then what ended up happening was that in the spring of 2005, I think 2 weeks before the negotiations were supposed to start, it turned out that the EU and the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia in The Hague had some talks behind closed doors, and so the EU came to Croatia and said, actually, this negotiation thing that's supposed to happen in a couple of weeks, we're not going to do it because you haven't handed over Ante Gotovina, and we've decided that we don't like that. And this is an interesting sort of case because the EU had said nothing about economic policies, which is what financial markets should care about, right? Is how well the countries are doing economically. They just suspended negotiations for a political reason. By contrast, Hungary's crisis was all about the economy basically being built on a web of lies. So what happened? So what happened? How did investors react? So we have sort of two situations here. We have, the riots in Hungary. This is the Szabadság tér, the Freedom Square in Hungary, where the central bank and other institutions are. It looks like people are raising their fists, but if you look closely, they're actually taking pictures with their mobile phones. So, it wasn't quite the government coup, but still, riots in the streets, burning buildings. This is something that usually should spook investors, right? So by contrast, we have, sort of standard issue nationalism in Croatia. Everybody knows the Balkans are kind of nationalistic. This should come as no surprise. Nothing economic going on here. And so what I'm going to show you now is it's essentially, you can think of them in terms of risk levels of the countries. These are spreads on sovereign debt, basically, these countries' versions of treasuries. So these are essentially interest rates on treasuries. Higher levels mean higher level of risks. So what happened in the big economic crisis in Hungary? You can't see it. Drat. Nothing. There's essentially a flat line. It's sort of obscured by all this, but you can kind of see at the end there, in the 30-day window around that event, there was basically very little in terms of market reaction at all. By contrast, you can see that better. Good. So what you see in Croatia, you can't really see the starting point, but where interest rates had been about 40 basis points or 4% when everybody thought that they were going to start negotiating with the EU, then they jacked up a full 2 percentage points, and in fact they stayed that way until December of that year, when incidentally Croatia had not yet handed over Gotovina, but the EU had said, oh well, we feel like you're going to do it eventually, so negotiations are back on. And this is really interesting, I think, because it shows the incredible faith that financial markets had put in the EU to put countries on a path that they were familiar with, or a path that they could predict. Unfortunately, what I'm going to end up arguing is that that this confidence was a little bit misplaced, but at least for the negotiators in the Big Bang round of enlargement, this was really a big deal for these countries. So essentially, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about the effects for the Big Bang countries as we saw them in terms of a couple of things. One is just the nature of the effect for of the risk reduction for the countries that were fortunate enough to for the post-communist countries that were fortunate enough to join the EU either in 2004 or in 2007. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the nature of that effect. But then I'm going to move on to talk about the different things that might be provoking market reaction in this way. And unfortunately, what I'm going to argue is that a little bit of the credibility that the markets put in the EU seems not to have been very well founded, and markets seem to be waking up to that in the sort of wake of the global financial crisis, I think. And so there, if we can think about whether this reaction, whether this sort of credibility boost that countries that join the EU get is rational by thinking of, 3 different sort of mechanisms behind which the reduction in risk might lie. And so the first is this notion that, this may be this big drop in risk, but in fact, countries have to do quite a bit in order to get into line with joining the EU. They have to reform all sorts of policies. They have to, wade through the acquis communautaire. That there's a lot of policy reform that has to happen in these countries. But we know, in fact, that a lot of these reforms were incomplete or rushed. We also know that many of these reforms have occurred in countries that weren't negotiating with the EU. And markets seem, I won't go into the statistics behind this, but the work that I've done has showed that markets seem to care much less about policy reform that countries undertake without the EU. For example, Turkey, which is now negotiating with the EU, but in fact had already done a lot of policy reform under the auspices of the IMF in the wake of the 2001 financial crisis there. Markets much preferred EU-endorsed policy reform than IMF-endorsed policy reform, turns out. The other thing that might be going on, you can think that markets would be thinking, would be that, the EU isn't just it's not just the OECD, it's not just like a country club. Once you get in, there are actually all these rules and all these regulations and there are enforcement mechanisms. So, once markets might be thinking that countries are going to be less risky because once they get into the EU, they're going to have to play by the rules. But in fact, we also know that EU countries break rules all the time. It's come up frequently in the panel that once countries enter the EU has very little leverage in shaping these countries' behavior, and the leverage that it does has, it's very reluctant to actually wield. So that's not quite it either. The thing that does possibly seem to be going on is that the EU actually does, as we've seen with the bailouts, act as a lender of last resort. So, because these countries are now in the EU, markets might think that the EU is not going to allow them to go bankrupt and will bail them out if they really hit the skids financially. And yet at the same time, we've seen that the EU has also been instrumental in orchestrating bailout packages for not even non-candidate countries, but people who aren't even on the official train to accession. Ukraine was a big beneficiary of the EU's bailout money. So that's sort of the current story. The happy story for those who managed to get on the boat at the right time was that there was a really big, for the countries that joined the EU in 2004 and in 2007, they had a extremely big, statistically significant drop in the risk levels associated with their debt. I will not bore you with the many layers of statistical analysis that I did behind this, but this result is robust to controlling for pre-existing policy reforms. So the things that countries had to do in order to join the EU doesn't matter. Oh, geez. It's also not just that the types of countries that the EU wanted to negotiate were the types of countries that markets tended to like anyway. This was a separate, distinct drop in risk. The other thing that I will not go into is that you saw too that candidate countries and people who had already joined into the EU, like in the Hungary example, were much more robust or were much less prone to spook investors if they had political crises or short-term economic shocks. So the same, the same sort of turbulent election that would rock Ukraine and send its risk levels way up didn't really seem to hurt EU candidate countries in quite the same way. But those effects aren't really so true for the countries that are negotiating now. And in fact, when I was on the train over here, I leaned over somebody's shoulder and saw that they were reading a big article about the elections that have just happened in Hungary and in Latvia. And they had a graph that I really wanted to grab out of the guy's hand that was exactly like the graphs that I was showing you here. It was interest rates on their debt. And normally the stuff that I've done has shown that when these countries have elections, nobody seems to really care. But now Hungary and Latvia, both members, have had sort of turbulent elections where the government has been thrown out and the interest rates have gone way up. So it seems like they're not really getting the break. This is just a sort of stylized, obviously Mechiar kind of problematized this, but this is the basic story of what happens to countries once they start negotiating with the EU. High risk levels, nobody knows what's going on, volatility, goes to big drop at negotiation, little further drop at accession, but the meat really happens once the EU sort of signals that it's serious about these countries. That's sort of the magnitude of the drop. The stars mean that it's statistically significant. Again, you see that the biggest drops happen in negotiation and accession stages. Again, this is for the Big Bang countries plus Bulgaria and Romania in 2007. Not so much the case for the guys that are on the train now. And whether this is a function of the fact that people don't believe that these countries are actually going to join the EU after all, or if it's just that markets are a little bit more wise to what the EU actually can and cannot do. I haven't really figured that out yet, but it's clear that there's some reduction in risk. It's not nearly as significant statistically, and it's not really the same story as before. Just real quickly, I was talking before about enforcement of rules. There's sort of an interesting case that happened last summer and fall when both Romania and Bulgaria were found to be in breach of EU rules, and the EU imposed a fine on Bulgaria. But not on Romania, even though the breach was really sort of similar. And so you see this is, risk rates for Bulgaria. Once the EU imposed the fine, the interest rates actually really shot up, whereas for Romania, it took a lot longer. But I think that I'm about out of time. So I'll just say really quickly that, as I said before, another thing that I've done is try to look at market reactions to announcements of the bailout of the various Eastern European countries, both members and non-members alike. And it's sort of really a mixed picture. It doesn't seem to really matter if you're Ukraine or if you're Latvia or if you're Hungary, which I think is a very different story than what you saw in the past. So just to wrap up, like I say, in terms of thinking about the theme of this conference, which is lessons for the Western Balkans, I think the major lesson is too bad you missed the boat. It seems like the time that the really good, sort of halo of what people thought the EU could and couldn't do is over. Even for those countries that are already in the EU, they don't get nearly the same break in terms of markets as they did even a couple of years ago. And whether that's just a function of the kind of increased risk aversion globally, or whether it's because people don't believe that the EU is as great as they once thought it was, is sort of unclear. Thanks.
Thank you, Julia. And our third panelist is Arista Maria Cirtautas, who's a visiting lecturer at the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. And she'll be addressing the Western Balkans lost in limbo between the Eastern Enlargement and the Eastern Partnership. Arista.
Thank you. I'd like to add my thanks to our hosts for bringing us out. This has been a wonderful opportunity to engage a subject that is endlessly fascinating, at least to those of us who've been working on EU enlargement for some number of years. The starting premise of my presentation is that the EU's engagement in the Western Balkans is currently stalled. It's caught in limbo between the old member states' well-known enlargement fatigue following upon the Eastern enlargement and the new member states' singular focus on the Eastern Partnership, namely engaging Eastern Europe and the South Caucasus countries in order to push back basically against Russian influence in this former sort of post-Soviet sphere. The result is that I think policy analysts are fairly, there's a consensus being reached here that even though the EU has been pushing strongly into the Western Balkans, is engaged in multiple ways. The EU Commission is engaged, ESDP missions are engaged. Everyone is engaged in the Western Balkans, and the resources being expended in the region on the EU side are significant. But on the other hand, we seem to have reached a point of diminishing returns. That for all of the EU's engagement, for the resources being expended, there's not much to show for it. That seems to be the current policy consensus. So my question is, how can the EU move beyond this rather unsatisfactory position based on the lessons of the Eastern enlargement? My short answer is that the new member states, specifically Poland, need to be more engaged. They need to become policy drivers for enlargement into the Western Balkans. Based on their experiences, the new member states have clearly embraced the lesson that the EU's enlargement process serves as a necessary anchor for domestic reforms, hence their support for a membership perspective for Ukraine and Moldova, and their push to commit more resources beyond beyond the European Neighborhood Policy to the Eastern Partnership, which is an initiative that was recently launched in Prague that was due to a Swedish-Polish partnership to deepen the EU's engagement with Ukraine, Moldova, even Belarus, and the South Caucasus countries. So they recognize that it's tremendously important for the EU to be engaged because of the effect that it has on promoting democratic reforms domestically. They also manifest a general support for the Western Balkans. Basically, the idea being keeping the enlargement process alive is important because once enlargement to the Western Balkans is successfully fulfilled, this should pave the way for the next enlargement round, namely to Ukraine and Moldova, which lies very dear to the hearts of especially sort of the northern tier new member states. But that general support, I argue, on the part of the new member states, needs to be crystallized into more concrete political initiatives in order to bring about a successful enlargement or a successful outcome for the Western Balkans. The key lesson here from the Eastern enlargement is that an important factor enabling the EU to serve as an anchor for reform during that period was the role played by member states committed to the process and driving it forward. The anchor, in fact, needed itself to be anchored in concrete political preferences and in political leadership. So I think that's a key lesson that's not been adequately realized. It seems fairly evident that political leadership should be part of the equation, but that seems not to be quite as evident, and the Western Balkans, the enlargement process towards the Western Balkans is typically referred to as lacking leadership. There's the lack of political engagement, a lack of political leadership on the part of the European Union. And this contrasts quite sharply with the political leadership and the sort of policy driver roles taken on by key member states during the Eastern enlargement. Most well known, of course, was the policy driver role of Germany in pushing for the Eastern enlargement, but also significant was the UK, then the Scandinavian countries. Most remarkably, and that's something that still needs to be studied more extensively, was Denmark's crucial role. Under the president, when Denmark held the rotating presidency, that was in 1993, and that was the first commitment on the part of the EU to even offering a membership perspective for the East European countries, and it's at that Copenhagen Council that we get the famous or infamous Copenhagen criteria. And then the Denmark again held the rotating presidency, which closed out successfully the accession process in December 2002. So Denmark played a pivotal role here in that process. So that's a key factor, or key lesson, I think, that the significance of political leadership and policy drivers, committed policy drivers. Additional factors of importance to take away from the Eastern enlargement that I think need to be sort of embedded or re-embedded into the process of Western Balkan enlargement is the need to provide or to present a compelling vision or narrative in which to embed the enlargement process. The Eastern enlargement, although admittedly this compelling vision or narrative was not adequately transmitted to West European publics, but nonetheless there was a compelling vision, and that vision revolved around restoring the unity of Europe in the aftermath of the Cold War. A sense of historic purpose accompanied the Eastern enlargement, and it may indeed have been essential, enabling not just the West Europeans to feel emboldened to take on this sort of historic moment and to open up to Eastern Europe, but it also empowered the East Europeans, since they were part owners, if you will, of this narrative of returning to Europe. They were returning to Europe not only, well, most obviously they were returning to Europe poorer than their West European cousins, but the argument on the East European side was that we're also returning wiser. We're returning wiser with a greater appreciation for democracy, for what Europe represents in normative terms because of the years spent behind the Iron Curtain. So if you look back on those years, and that's what I've done in my research, is to sort of look at the discursive construction of the Eastern enlargement, you find a very powerful sort of mutually enabling narrative that gave purpose, that there's a sense of overwhelming purpose here, that we are engaged in something that, albeit very difficult and unprecedented, we must drive this forward. And the key voices constructing this narrative were political elites from the policy driver states in Western Europe, and political elites, particularly in Central Europe. So the Wałęsas, the Havels, the former dissidents, leaders now of their independent countries, were very important. And finally, there was a role also significantly played by public intellectuals like Timothy Garton Ash in the UK, Alexander Smolar in Paris. So there was a number of very key there was a lot of gravitas, if you will, intellectual gravitas associated with the construction of this discursive journey that the Eastern enlargement was being created around. And also the media, the sort of EU-centric media, the Financial Times, The Economist, sort of everyone was chiming in, saying that this is a necessary mission. This is a historic undertaking, and it cannot be allowed to derail on technical issues or on minor points. We have to push this forward. So that's something to keep in mind. So in addition to policy drivers, there was also the construction of a compelling vision or narrative that helped to promote the process. A third factor that I don't think gets adequate recognition that helped to push forward the Eastern enlargement in spite of all of the bumps and hurdles along the way was a sense of urgency. There was, I think, a prevailing opinion, although it wasn't very often articulated openly in the press, if at all. There was a prevailing sense of urgency, namely that this was we were at a historic moment, and there was a limited window of opportunity vis-a-vis Russia. And in fact, that this has, of course, turned out to be true, that Russia did become more resurgent and is much more aggressively sort of trying to counterbalance and even push back the EU. So there was, for reasons that turn out to be quite accurate, there was the concern, not just among the candidate countries in Eastern Europe, that they would face this limited window of opportunity before Russia woke up again, but also in Brussels. Interestingly, there was a sense that we have to push this forward now, because if we take too long with it, that the outcome may not be what we desire. So these, I think, are important lessons to take from the Eastern enlargement: political leadership, a compelling narrative, as well as a sense of urgency that this was a moment that shouldn't be wasted. Interestingly, the new member states, or neither the new member states nor the old member states, have quite grasped these seemingly obvious lessons from the Eastern Enlargement. So I asked myself, why? You know, why isn't the need for political leadership and narrative and urgency? Why isn't this more prevalently positioned in the lesson learning literature on the Eastern Enlargement? And I think one possible reason is that the lesson learning literature has been somewhat monopolized by the EU Commission, by the EU establishment, by bureaucrats and diplomats, basically. And when they look at the Eastern Enlargement, they see it in different ways. They don't see it they don't see it as a political construction. They see it as a technical construction, as a legal, rational construction. And so the lessons that they take away from the Eastern Enlargement is they analyze the Eastern Enlargement in such a way as to minimize the focus on political leadership, and instead sort of they privilege the technicalities of the process itself and how it can be refined in light of the Western Balkans. So, for example, Dr. Timo Summa, who was engaged very extensively with the negotiations vis-a-vis Bulgaria and Romania, recently wrote an essay on, the lessons learned from the Eastern Enlargement and how they can apply to the Western Balkans. And it's a very technical list. No prefixed accession dates, more focus, fewer priorities. Start with the most difficult institutional reforms first. Mobilize middle management. Increase productivity and salaries in the public sector. Improve donor coordination. Invest more in regional cooperation. Inform the European public. And build strong safeguards into the Treaty of Accession. Now, all of this is obviously completely relevant and useful, but it doesn't help us get beyond the technical process. It doesn't help create a broader legitimation for the enlargement to the Western Balkans. Similarly, when it comes to the way in which the EU Commission and the DG for Enlargement is working on the narrative component or the discursive component of enlargement, although they say clearly, we need to inform the European public about the utility of enlargement, they have chosen to do so in such a limited way that does not correspond at all to the narrative associated with the Eastern Enlargement. For example, Olli Rehn, the Commissioner for Enlargement, recently in a speech commemorating the 5th-year anniversary of the Eastern Enlargement said that, well, it's not just a sense of moral obligation that informs the enlargement of the European Union. It's also in our self-interest. And then, he went through the stabilization of the borders and, security and stabilization, basically. Well, again, these are important attributes associated with the EU's enlargement, or the appropriate benefits, certainly appropriate benefits associated with the EU's enlargement, but they don't stir hearts and minds. This isn't the kind of transcendent narrative that we heard, the sort of stirring rhetoric that, I remember when Tony Blair went to Eastern Europe. I think his speech in Poland was written by Timothy Garton Ash, so it was a very, very good speech. We heard historic rhetoric coming from West European leaders associated with the enlargement process. Olli Rehn, by comparison, doesn't really seem to offer that much. Basically, my point is that by making sure that, or by allowing the EU's technocrats, if you will, and diplomats to monopolize the lesson learning analysis of the Eastern Enlargement, there's a way in which the charismatic context of the Eastern Enlargement has been routinized, and we now see enlargement as a solely technocratic process. And that, I think, does a great injustice to the process of enlargement and also renders it immeasurably more difficult. So what's the solution here? The solution basically is for more drama to be re-injected into the enlargement process. Greater story needs to be told. More political vision needs to be applied to the project. And I can't think of a country that's better able to generate drama than Poland in the European Union. Poland is nothing if not assertive since enlargement, and I won't go through the list of examples of Poland's assertiveness, both positive and constructive assertiveness, as well as sometimes obstructionist assertiveness. But I think Poland is well positioned. It is a large country. It thinks strategically about enlargement and about the EU's role in the region and also globally. It also has the requisite messianic national character. We've heard that Poland often falls prey to a victim complex, and that's true. It is the Christ of nations, after all. But accompanying this sort of victim narrative is a narrative of historic purpose, of a sort of a messianic sense of destiny. And that messianic sense of destiny puts Poland very much or very comfortably on the same plane as the United States, France, and the UK in terms of thinking in broader terms. So I would argue that Poland is well positioned for reasons of its strategic interests as well as its national character to take on the Western Balkans. However, it needs to be encouraged to do so. Currently, Poland is engaged more specifically in terms of structuring the EU's relationship to Ukraine and also trying to shape the EU's response to Russia and the reassertion of Russian interests in the post-Soviet space. So here I think it's important for American diplomats and the Obama administration to perhaps consider not just how to address the Western Balkans in partnership with the conventional West European actors, namely the Troika, Britain, UK, France, and Germany, but also to think about engaging the new member states, specifically Poland, and saying that with their specific heritage, with their legacy, with their experiences, who could be better positioned to offer greater guidance and leadership and a sense of purpose and direction to the EU's engagement in the Western Balkans. So Poland needs to be sort of encouraged, hopefully with American assistance, to shift its attention not so much straight east, but down south and southeast as well, because I think that would be a constructive use of the commitment that the new member states have been showing, albeit in a more general sense, to the continuation of the EU's enlargement project.
Okay, thank you very much, Arista. I think we're only 15 minutes behind schedule, and so we'll go
entirely due to me.
We'll go directly to Ron. But first, join me in thanking our panelists for excellent talk. And now I'll turn the floor over for the remainder of the meeting to Ron Linden, distinguished professor at the Department of Political Science, University of Pittsburgh, and not incidentally, the chairman of our academic advisory board here at East European Studies. And Ron will give a roundup, an assessment of the impact of what we said, as well as let me waste some more time for you, as well as lead the discussion. Okay,
Thank you, Marty. And don't worry, I won't take the entire rest of the day. For one thing, I have a flight to catch, so you'll be sure I'll be on time. I do want to take a moment to thank the progenitors of Title VIII, and I was there at the beginning, and it's been a remarkable program. I think the American taxpayer has gotten more bang for the buck out of that program than virtually any, with the possible exception of nuclear inspection in Iraq. But it is a wonderful program, and the people, every single one of the presenters today, and myself included, were Title VIII alums, and we as taxpayers and scholars of the region should be proud of them. I'm not going to thank Nita for inviting me to do this, because she's given me an impossible task, which is to pull these presentations together. Of course, not having heard them before, it wasn't their fault. They were done this way on purpose, and to try to integrate it into some sort of sense about what we can learn about the impact of the EU on the region, and what possible lessons there are for the Western Balkans. So I'm going to do that brilliantly. And I'm going to integrate it as a backdrop with some of the literature about the region, to sort of say, well, what is the literature that we in graduate education focus on, that we expect to have, and what have we heard today that might meld with that literature? People like Milada Vachidova, her work. Judith Kelly worked on minorities. Wade Jacoby, who worked on a number of integration and assessment things. Rachel Epstein on economics. Alina Munju-Pipidi and Anna Jamala-Boos. All of these people have addressed this question as well as many others. So the first thing I'm going to do is disagree with Arista. I don't think the lesson learning literature has been captured by the Commission, though I think I can understand why they would want to. I think there are a lot of people out there making up for the fact, as Peter correctly noted, that we didn't predict 1989. You didn't know that I actually did. I had it on a little thumb drive. I had an article and I lost it. You didn't get the memo, but a lot of people have been writing and trying to assess it. So we can maybe look at some of this and say to ourselves, what factors seem to account for EU's impact such as it is? What seems to matter? Recognizing, well, I'll come back to this, recognizing that the time frame is, after all, fairly short. One, process seems to matter. The crucial question seems to be when. Impact, Vachidova is particularly strong on this, and we heard some of this in the discussion today, that the incentives are higher when membership is in play. When membership is in play, everybody behaves, or at least appears to behave. When membership is no longer in play because it's been achieved, well, not surprisingly, shall we say, the concentration of the mind takes a holiday. And we lose some of that strong energy. And so timing matters. Timing is crucial. Couple of interesting points from the discussion today. I think it was Steve who drew attention to the no votes on further expansion, which of course took place after the class of 2004, although before the class of 2007. But here's one piece of counter evidence, which you don't have time enough to go into today. Alina Munju-Pipidi has written a very interesting piece comparing progress on negotiations with the timing. Do we see states, especially the more prominent members, Poland, new members, Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, and Hungary? She found that progress on democratic reforms actually slowed down during the negotiations. While progress for those outliers who may never get in, Albania, Bosnia, actually speeded up. So timing isn't enough. It sort of depends on what you might call, I think the EU does call it, your membership perspective. Secondly, sector matters. And I'm so glad to see that second panel called sector specific. It's one thing to say, here's a bunch of election rules to follow. Here's a process that you can follow for allowing open elections and formalizing freedoms, engaging civil society. It's quite another to put in place actual protection for minority rights, as Zsuzsa pointed to. Or the issue of poverty that was raised. I think it was Tracie, correct me if I'm Diana, who pointed out that there are no specific rules necessarily that apply to poverty. So sector matters. If the EU has clear, unambiguous, well-established, and, here I'll come back to something Peter said, credible norms to establish and to push, then it matters. Then it can make a difference. If they don't, because they themselves don't follow the rules, or they don't exist, and Roma is, of course, a perfect example, the media is another, which Peter referred to, then you find less impact. Because the East European governments, leaders, people are not stupid. They can see, it's different than if your mother says, wait till your father gets home, than if your father is actually home. It makes a big difference if there's shall we say, a credible policy or commitment. I do think to some extent Arista is exactly right. It has to do with what the narrative is that's being put forth. And I was so glad she mentioned something that is so often forgotten, especially in Washington, no offense, the moral aspect. The Europeans did feel like they owed the East Europeans. They always said, we're happy to bring you in as soon as those nasty boys go back to Moscow. We're happy to bring you in. You were divided through no fault of your own. Well, when the bet was called, they had to step up. And Ash in particular called them to it, as well as others. So did Havel and others, and so now is the time to do it. That's different. than a very instrumental rationale, which you correctly identified with Olli Oren and several others. Well, we have to do this because it's in our own interests. However, it does point to a third relevant section, which is domestic politics. The reason Olli Oren, of course, is pointing to that is because it's a little late for that narrative, and you need something new. Domestic politics matters. We found this from all of the literature, from Vachidova and Wade Jacoby. It matters, for example, to go back to the Peter's excellent presentation. Is there a domestic norm, let's say, on media? How firmly is it held, let's say, on minorities? And Zsuzsa pointed to that. Is there a domestic norm, and how fiercely is it held by the population and by the elites? Zsuzsa pointed to the Baltic states, which were able to finesse the minority by not calling them minorities. And of course, the EU caved, a point she didn't make, but Arista probably would have made. The EU did. Oh, yes, that's right. They're really not minorities, because they wanted these countries in, and they were cognizant of their history, and of course they also wanted to creep a little closer to Mother Russia. And they also knew that in terms of domestic politics, that was a fiercely held view, and it was going to be a non-starter. And that makes a difference in some of the constructivist literature points to this, on whether a norm is put in place and whether it actually makes a difference in a couple of years down the road, 3 years down the road. People always say to me, they always focus on the Romanians. Well, are the Romanians really doing this because they've really changed? Are they really behaving? Or are they just doing this to get into the EU? And that's when I tell them to call Peter, because I don't have the answer to that question. But I'm going to come back to the Romanians as well. We also learned from several people here, especially Stephen, focusing on this. I thought was absolutely terrific for him to highlight the importance of legacy. That's not a beeper for me. The importance of legacy. That is, why aren't there trade unions? Why aren't there? Well, people didn't forget that trade unions were completely bogus under the communists. They were completely manipulated, and people are suspicious. A point he didn't make, because it wasn't in the area he was looking at, was the widespread suspicion of political parties, a very low level of trust of political parties. One of the ironies is that we know that democracy, and I think we can generally agree these states are democratic, can develop even without strong political parties. Kind of remarkable. Well, we shouldn't be surprised that trust in political parties is low because of the legacy of where these states came from. Peter was the only one to mention the pre-communist period, but it makes a difference, especially in this region, where these things are carried on. Others have pointed to the strength of political competition. Ironically, the strength of the what you might call the legacy communist party. Jamala Bush's work in particular points, so does Vachidova. It depends on how strong that party is. I've lost count of the number of factors, but this might...
As a sense of honesty. The Economist famously reported some of the interviews that he gave as he was exiting Bosnia, where he basically said he didn't want to be riding a dead horse anymore. And that was a not so diplomatic way of saying that it's not the Bosnians that he was referring to as a dead horse, but the international community's presence in Bosnia was basically failing, and the state was collapsing. So that was the dead horse he was referring to. But what was interesting was that the sense of shock in Bosnia over, how could he say such a thing? Because they'd been used to hearing this rhetoric from the EU and from the West European capitals. Oh, you're doing fine. Everything is fine. Just keep going. And here he comes along and smashes it all up and says, no, this is all an abysmal failure. So one of the things that I've seen that people in the region want is they want clear language. They want the EU to give them clear criticism about what is working, what isn't working, and Leszek did do that. So I think if we could get him to re-engage and use his experience and bring that maybe to bear with sort of Polish input into the Swedish presidency, that would be the optimal moment to do that. So it was an experiment, and I think it failed not because of his talents, but because of the lack of support he was given.
Other question?
We've beaten them into submission.
Oh, I could ask the question, but it's the same one I ask all the time across the hall to Nida. but this is close to my heart because we're here talking all afternoon about lessons for the Western Balkans. And if you take a look at the Western Balkans, whether or not you include Croatia, you're talking about 22 million people. Period. That's less than Romania. It's not very many people, and they're all interrelated and intermixed. I would think that it would not be so hard for the EU to devise mechanisms to take these people in so they stop causing trouble with each other and perhaps for their neighbors. But yet we have these elaborate discussions here in Washington. This can't be done, that can't be done, I don't do this, that, a key, but something has to be done. Or, now they're talking about a Bosnia, which is having all these meetings. I don't know if the president is taking any mind of it, but there's some people want him to. Need to be more assertive again in Bosnia, U.S. role. And then pretty soon, if things don't get better in Kosovo, we'll have a mess there too. And, the EU hurried up and took some dubious countries into themselves, but they left out the ones that really needed the help the most, and who, ironically, before they started killing each other, were way ahead on the scheme of things than the countries that are in the EU now. So, anyway. I'm not asking the same. I'm just saying, NIDA, will you please use your influence to do this? And maybe this is a good time just to say, to close this meeting and thank NIDA, by the way, whose idea this conference was really, and who put this together. We had been given money, as we said, as an unprecedented gesture by the State Department. We thank them for this. I think it was, if I don't say so myself, it went quite well. We also got some help from our staff, from staff of Southeast Europe, which is our cousin operation, which some of them are affected by this too, but we don't want to bring Turkey in because that's a whole new ball game. We're talking about the Balkans. So, as they say, in some religions, next year in Jerusalem, we say next year, somehow they find a way to bring the Western Balkans, if not into the EU as members, under the warm embrace thereof, somehow. And with that, let's thank the panelists again for